upload it to YouTube. You're gonna be a YouTube star.
Oh Jesus! I don't like hearing myself speak. Just never share that link with me ever.
Oh man, it's gonna be private, but I might post it in a channel. Just pretend. Don't click on it.
Just make sure you put a fair warning. So I don't...
I'm gonna say, Sean, do not click here.
So let me send you this quick thing. I literally, honestly, put it together in like 15 minutes.
Okay. Maddie is battling ADA over here, and Patti is battling Commerce SDK, so I don't want to distract him.
Are we close with Statue, or is there like a ton of issues still on?
Oh, Statue is done. StatueCruises.com is at 0 ADA errors as of last night at like 11 o'clock at night.
Oh, perfect.
Rach finished it. There was 6 errors, but all of them were related to the Angular pages. So once he finished the Angular pages, they were all clear.
Wait, there was only 6 issues originally?
No. We started at 65. That one we battled for almost 2 weeks, but you just keep in mind how many of us it was. It was like 3 of us here, and then Chandran did a few for us.
Is that how you pronounce it?
I don't know.
Oh, okay.
Don't take my name for it.
They say it's Shanda. Well, because it's always Eddie that's pronounces his name, and it's like Americanized.
Yeah, and I wouldn't take Eddie's pronunciation either. How are your last few days? Everything good?
Yeah, everything's good so far.
Okay, good.
Yeah, like the office here is pretty much empty.
Everyone's gone, right?
Like there's like AB's hasn't been in the office all week so far, and Sandy and a few other people.
Okay. So this is going to be helpful. This is shared. Let me just share this with everybody else. I'm going to make them be able to edit. Okay. Okay. I'm just going to post it on web. Cool, duder. Let's kick this off. All you, man. You drive.
Let's see. Just to start, this is going to be a little bit rough. I tried to think of a kind of a way to describe essentially how Salt and how it interacts with the infrastructure. But essentially, I broke it down here by basically the repos that are associated. So AWS Tools is the bootstrapper.
Okay.
Salt is the orchestrator that basically implements any of those changes and settings that are in Salt to apply to a specific node or multiple nodes. And Pillar is basically the configurator. These are my words, not necessarily theirs. A pillar is basically where you define the variables, SSH keys, anything that is directly related that can be set up as a define. So that also includes any defines that we've kind of set up for, any of the private and public keys that we have set up for, sentiment or user logins and passwords, and they're all encrypted within there, so that even if a person is able to see them in the repo, they're encrypted, so then they're not open to the public, essentially.
Okay.
So GitHub, AWS Tools. I'm not going to go through an build of any of a specific of the bootstrapper, because then I would have to go in and remove and delete everything. But basically, this bootstrapper was built originally to build everything have 2 instances for everything. So that is also another thing that you might need to either modify or create a second, basically a second file, bootstrap file that's for staging only, and keep the original one for anything production-wise.
Okay. And
basically, the bootstrapper builds out 2 instances of RDS, sets up the EFS volumes, and sets up certificates, SSL certificates associated with it, if there is a one at that time. Otherwise, there's the parameters are somewhat optional. And so Python, this is basically the simple script. Basically, you need up to here, site code, whatever the environment is, staging or production, and then it will just build it out essentially.
Very nice. This is the equivalent of Terraform.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with Terraform, but I'm assuming it's some type of bootstrapper / setup tool, essentially.
Yeah.
And this is perfect. This is built specifically for our sites and basically how we built it, at least in the past. And so let's start with, let's go into Pillar. It's always a good way to kind of, oops. So Pillar is basically where you define anything for each of the sites. So we have the first 3 letters of the site name, and then web, and then -prod or staging, depending what it is. In this case, it kind of breaks down. These are just basically the defines that kind of get read in, and then they get pushed out based on these rules, essentially. Okay. So you can see that these remote system logs, this basically tells where the logs are at, and then also where there's some setup with these remote system logs that go into paper trail. WordPress has some also generic defines and kind of set up in a way for that as well. So we have the site. These kind of are the things that kind of get defined, I think, for this portion. And some of these rules here, they are kind of how it sets up within, or maybe that's below here. I don't know, that's Apache. That's what I was looking for. So there is the setup for Apache, defines there, and then some other WordPress setup. And then, so this is basically, right here is the username and password for the WordPress CMS system. Here's some database information that's kind of defined, basically the RDS instance. So that's why you build that bootstrapper, use that bootstrapper first, so that you get all the defines that are kind of set up already, and then you can just insert them in here. Every site is set up very similarly. The database goes directly to the WordPress, and then we also create a separate DB user and password so that we're not using the root to access it. And it's always it only accesses the specific WordPress database.
Okay.
And then general information here. Yeah, and then you also have to define the EFS volumes that get outputted within that bootstrapper. And then SSL certificates if needed at the time. Otherwise, if it's a non-SSL site, then it shouldn't, although all our sites should have an SSL certificate at this point, except for our small microsites.
Okay.
And then we also have some other defines that might not be related directly to all the sites, like Redis endpoint and the ports. And this is specific for Niagara, I believe, and Alcatraz potentially. I think it might just be on Niagara. And so all of these are built similarly. And then these are kind of the defines that kind of set up for the specific site and then the staging or production environment.
Okay. And
then so from here, you can see that there's users. We are under this, what is it? Developers WordPress? Is it developers WordPress? Oh, dev, sorry. So these are basically where I've been adding your SSH keys. Very easy to add. You guys are all sudo users essentially, and then the keys allows you access to the servers, individual servers. And so these can be defined here. Ascenders, Caxi, these are all some of the previous vendors that we had or current vendors that we have. And then we have a specific one for deployer keys that are only used for deploying, so that I can't remember exactly which this deploys to, but I think this is also set up for, I think it's when it comes to what is it, GitHub potentially? I'm not sure.
Okay. And so how often do you run this? Because I'm sure it's self-aware that it knows, okay, the environment already exists, there's no teardown. But
go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, but you ran it when you, for example, deployed our SSH keys, and you ran it when we modified the INI file the other day. So how often do you find yourself running this?
Not as often as you think. It really depends if you're making modifications to the environment itself. And then also if you're making modifications to, htaccess file, which I've been modifying for like 301 redirects and stuff like that. As I go a little bit further, I can kind of show you the cases of when you would actually run salt for certain things and when other times when you don't really need to.
Okay.
And then so this top.sls file basically has the set rules. So every site gets these user ops and user devs essentially. And then you can see some of these other permissions that other files that they get associated with. So, CAXI, so the users for CAXI, they only have access to our Hornblower, Niagara Cruises servers, and they don't have access to everything else. So these are kind of just the defined rules for that.
Okay.
Let's go into.
That looks good.
Salt. Let's do Salt Cloud. Salt Cloud is the deployer. This is pretty straightforward. There's honestly probably only one file that you really need to worry about here, and the rest are just general setup Salt code. And essentially, it's this WordPress.map file. And this is what I was talking with you before, Nazi, with that you can define the legs essentially associated with each environment. So if we probably will remove the second leg for, San Diego whale watching staging. So we would just remove all of these out. Okay. And so then they would just remove from this. So what Salt Cloud does essentially is if you run a command, let's see, where's that? Basics. If you run this command, basically it's sudo Salt Cloud, you're basically mapping to this point, which is the location on the server. Map, WordPress map, basically it checks all those legs, see if they exist. If they don't exist, then they'll say, do you want to build that leg, essentially? And so if we remove the legs, that we ever run this mapping system again, then we would never pick up on those additional legs. Okay. So it makes it easier for you guys, and so you don't have to worry about like, oh, if I remove these nodes now, will it recreate later?
Got it.
And so basically this purely just generates the actual nodes itself. It doesn't do anything other than that. And then that's not really needed for now. I can explain that later.
Okay. So the cloud is infrastructure.
Yeah. So I call it the builder.
Got it.
We talked about the pillar, which is the configurator, and now we're going to Salt.
The orchestrator.
So this is basically set rules about how the environment is built. So each of these pieces are part of basically what builds those nodes. So you have the node that was built from Salt Cloud. You have pillar that defines those variables within your environment. And then now you have Salt that has basically the infrastructure from all points. So it's the WordPress build out environment. It's also the PHP versioning and any of that kind of stuff. We have some of these other Node.js instances. I think these were used for some of the sites that needed it with NPM at the time, using NPM to kind of build some assets. Some of this actually has some build out from. So before we actually had Alcatraz Cruises right before we moved it over to that new site that we have, but that's a WordPress site. And actually we migrated that Alcatraz instance from what it was from, the Drupal setup. So Alcatraz was the word Drupal setup, but on AWS for a small period. It was like a nightmare to get configured and set up, but it was built. And then I think those files I don't know if they're still here, but basically these are any kind of Salt infrastructure kind of setup is all built in here. Okay. Within here, so I think the most important ones are like, so Liberato is just, anything we've been using with that with kind of tracking of, traffic and any, what Liberato does. So I'm not going to go into that. Yeah. Orchestration, this is actually where the remote syslog information is. So all those defines are kind of getting set up. And so you'll see some of these like curly brackets that get pushed out based on the variables that are set up.
Got it. Yeah, you showed me those a few minutes ago. Okay. And then in the orchestration folder, what really occurs? I mean, anything that you've ever had to modify there, what does it do? Salt function? No, it looks very light.
Yeah, I don't think this is I think specifically for salt, but basically all the rules are set up once salt it's all in the background of salt, of the general base of it that kind of has all the tools that you need. And so these are just reading in rules essentially to set it up. And yeah, there are most of this is pretty much custom. And it's based on, depending on what you kind of need for a site. So Apache, but a lot of this is all documentations. A lot of it can be pulled in and just associating it based on the needs of what your sites need, essentially.
Got it.
The files that I really go into, but I'm sure Emerson will have a better, he's worked in Salt Stack. I've asked him before. Yeah. And so he might have a better idea of like kind of the general setup. So everything right here is all three of these repos are actually built in Python. I don't know if you can tell.
yeah, I saw even the execution was PY. Yes.
And so it's funny because Salt actually can build Salt on itself. So you can run Salt on Salt. So there's a Salt server that you can actually run Salt on to run the same kind of similar configurations for that to handle, which it's kind of very meta.
Looks good.
And so each site has very similar rules. So like, remember how we had that top file as well before? It also has the same kind of defined rules. So top will inherit users and these items that are here, like syslogs and Liberato, applies it to all directly and based on those rules. And then you can also have in settings based on what you need for each site. So like you may need a Apache mod rewrite rule or SSL or rewrite rule, but maybe another site you don't need it. And so these are all how it's all defined, but it's all within here.
Okay.
And if you ever need more tools, you can always add to the tools. So like Apache, there's mod headers, mod whatever, but you may not need it, but you can always add to it. It's very easy to do, essentially.
I see. And then in the case of Liberato, have we had to modify that, or just it's once it's in place, there's no
it's already so it's already in place. It applies to it's already connected. Any of the rules that you basically want to modify within, you can create your own rules within Liberato itself.
Perfect. That's what my question was. Like, do I need to go in to put any rule sets in there at all?
No. So like, honestly, if you build the environment similarly to everything, it's going to have everything that you have for every single site. It's all the same.
Very cool.
So yeah, so you would need to fill out these kind of defined roles and stuff like that. And so within each, I think they all use this WordPress and use this WordPress wconfig. So we were having some issues within WordPress where we were not able to, we want to create defines that were sending information. So accept those defines for, sentiment to pull in those keys, or using, what is the other payment tool or global payments to use their keys. And so that's why we set up this WP config to handle all that. So within this WP config, it basically creates base rules about generating this custom config PHP file for every single site that gets built. And then within each of those, you'll see that there's a base custom config file that pulls in some of the generic rules about WordPress. So disallow file edit, so that we're not able to modify files directly on the server. Can't do update core on the server directly, and some other rules here. And then we can also set up a general, environment define that space here, and some other rules here.
Very good. That's very good, actually.
And so then if you look in here, so there's one for staging. So it's built like this. So custom -config.php, and then you would do www.site or staging.thesite. And so here you can see that all these rules have those defines built in here.
Yeah.
And so all those defines are the same defines that I showed you in Pillar a second ago that were all, what's the word? Compressed.
Yeah.
What is
Compiled.
not compiled? Not, I don't know. You know what I mean? Basically,
Yeah.
that they're not readable.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm blanking. It's been a
No
long
problem.
time. And it's close to the holidays too, so.
Yeah, you've got more than the right excuses, by the way. You've got. And now, when I look at this, so everything uses these variables. So all those variables we saw earlier, they're like global variables.
Which ones?
Because all this global payment merchandise, global payments API, global payment. Where is that defined?
Yeah, so all these variables are defined within this WP or this custom config.php file.
Got it.
Which lies inside the root of the WordPress site.
Okay, perfect, man. I got it. It's coming together now.
Yes, this is, yeah. And then every site has some basics. So if it doesn't have any defined rules with a website, it'll pull in the base like htaccess rules here for htaccess. And then there is also one for staging that pulls in the base one right here. And then also that standard basic auth that we have on every single staging site, basically the Hornblower access login authentication piece. So that it's all consistent across the board, and it doesn't really matter who sees our staging site. But just the reason why we have it is because we don't want Google to read our pages, our staging pages, and also for SEO, for SEO purposes too.
Okay, got it. Makes perfect sense.
And you'll also see that there are CLI. Oh, I think this is to, I think, install the CLI client for WordPress on every single site, on every single node. I did also mention there's a few sites that are not set up with Travis CI, their CI process is not set up in a different way, which probably will change when you guys move everything to GitLabs and everything is in place. But essentially, these are the 5 sites that have this automatic every 5 minutes will deploy to whatever is inside the Git repo to the environment. Okay. And so it's the blog, NCHR, which is the Niagara HR site, intranet style, essentially, WordPress site, and then San Diego Whale Watching. And this one can actually be deleted. And then the SF Winter on the Waterfront promo site, or winteronthewaterfront.com site.
Okay. And the Niagara HR one is the only one I don't think I've been exposed to yet. Is that publicly facing, or is that password protected?
It's not public at all. Tim Bankert probably could give you more information. I don't even have access myself outside of the servers and the general background of it, but not necessarily into the system because I don't deal with anything Niagara. I don't need to be in the Niagara internet for any real reason.
Makes sense. Okay.
But outside of the general structure, yeah, that's essentially all that's set up. And then you'll also see some other rules for the EFS volumes within WordPress, how they talk to where it's mapped, and then multi-site, which is used specifically, some rules that we have set up specifically for Alcatraz and Niagara because they are built out as a multi-site environment. Redis definitions as well. Remember I was showing you that Niagara had one and it was set up, those defines were set up there. Yeah. And then
where is Redis being used again?
Just for Niagara and Alcatraz. I think for Niagara specifically, and I think it has to do somewhere in the checkout process. I think they might use Redis. I think.
Okay.
Not exactly how it's set up.
Okay.
To be honest.
Okay, no worries.
I think it's general server caching in general.
Okay. Fair enough.
Let's see. Yeah, so you can see also the PHP defines, they have the specific PHP items that we need to install, the packages that need to be installed and whatnot that are kind of set up here.
Okay. Yeah, all those packages. Yep. And you define even that shit.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is build basically an environment from scratch, and it's basically building an empty node that has no information on it at all until you actually apply it.
Yeah. Yeah. That's very cool.
And so here you can see the source of the PHP INI file, for example, and can easily be modified within files.
Okay. Yeah, that's important every once in a while.
Yeah, so when we made those changes, I already applied it to all our sites.
That was awesome. That was such an epic, easy change. And I thought that was going to be a massive change.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's kind of just the general code side of Salt. I should probably add a little bit more information on there, but let's go into the Salt server itself.
Here, this is a good one for you. Looping in Sean, because Jami Kapla from Quebec is addressing you.
It's just Jamie.
Oh, sorry.
I know. I thought the same thing when I met him. I was like, Jamie. I was like, how do you pronounce this name?
I think he thinks you were on the chain with us the whole time. I just looped you in.
Okay, I'll check it out.
Okay, but it's a perfect example for this because it's basically a conditional change. So he wants us to remove .htaccess on staging for hornblower.com because Moncito can't input a password for those type of prompts. It can do it for HTML forms, but not for those types of prompts. So like that use case, how do you go about doing that in Salt just to one site?
Well, just a general case. Salt is not set up with Elastic Beanstalk at all. Because it's a one-off basically site. So when we built, originally the Hornblower site was actually on, a long time ago, it was actually on like a single server, dedicated server that was actually in the basement of the boat. So the boat ever sunk, we would lose our site a long time ago. And then eventually we migrated those servers off and moved them to Quebec, and Quebec actually hosted the servers basically as a resource to like handle the servers. So we own the servers, but they service them.
Okay.
And then eventually when we moved to AWS, so essentially we never integrated Salt in any form with using Elastic Beanstalk because the plan was originally to get off of that environment and build a site, Hornblower off of something else or using Salt.
Makes perfect sense. Okay, so we have to remove it by hand in staging.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Got it. Okay, and then you were going to show me something. You were going to SSH into something.
Yes, so you have to run your command somehow. So Salt has its own server, and I mentioned that you can also run Salt on Salt, just as a kind of funny joke, I guess. Because there are defines within Salt, like that define Salt's rules and stuff like that. So some of these like master SLS, these are rules that are getting applied to Salt itself.
Okay.
So when you do run it, you could potentially run some of the changes. So if you ever run into issues with Salt itself, you can always make modifications.
Okay. And that box is also on AWS?
Yep. Everything is in AWS except for Statue. Yeah, except for Statue.
Oh, man.
And I guess some of the off like ticket, like Statue's ticket site or store site is not, I don't think is on AWS. It's hosted by Game Master or Gateway.
Okay. Yeah.
So Salt has.
Go ahead.
What's that?
Sorry.
So Salt has. So I'll also include basically where Salt is listed. So Salt is under this SRV/Salt. This is basically the repo. It gets pulled. So essentially, it's you guys are more than welcome to remove or replace the Git config file with GitLabs. Essentially, if they're the exact at this point, you can probably change them.
Okay.
And then also pillar is just one pillar away, one pillar. And then they have all the same kind of rules there. And then the same one, I think Salt Cloud is the only one that's a little bit farther out. It's an etc. or etc. Salt. And so then you can also see rules. So if you ever do any Git pulls on this, there has been some weirdnesses with the server with, so let's see, Git pull with this permissions denied. So if that ever happens, then you can always just run the shell script update repo and it should.
Oh, that's good to know. Good to know. Okay.
This is a side note. And so I listed a few commands and I mentioned in, so if you were trying to run, so the most common one you'll use is sudo salt. You can define your rules or define your host in any way. So you can be like star.staging.hbint.io. So this would basically apply to every single staging site on, or you can always adjust it to a specific Hornblower, New York, web. And then, so if you do state.highstate, highstate is just a general rule that will run the salt configurations and will run everything on the specific node. So if I run this, this will search for this specific node. So anything that has this parameters with 0, 1 or 0, 2, or well, in this case, it's only with 0, 1 since we removed all the 0, 2s for staging.
Yeah.
It'll take a moment, but essentially, oh, maybe not because the node is off.
Ah, okay.
But it really doesn't hurt to run. Let's just do it on one. It doesn't really hurt to run high state on any node at any time. If the configurations are set, like you won't really break anything.
Okay. Okay.
So generally it will go through the entire list and read all the rules and see, okay, if something is missing, you'll see that everything is successful and there's no fails. And if there is a fail, then you have to go back in and modify it and figure out why that issue is broken. And so these are, you'll see like an entire list of all the rules that are already set up. So these are all just saying, oh, this already exists. Let's keep on continuing. So like Python PIP is already installed, so let's move on. Okay. Got it. And so if you add in, so then this also reads in when running this. So if you have a modification to the INI file, this will say that something was changed and that you can see it in like color. And also if you search the color red, or not search red, but you see anything in red, then you can tell that something didn't actually work successfully. Makes sense. So it validates what's already there, it's doing a diff at the same time. Right. You'll notice you'll notice through this process that you have to be careful with sometimes some of the settings you kind of set up with. So like, for example, you know, the Apache files that kind of set up the rules within a specific domain. So if you have a record that's like www.niagaracruises.com and you have specific commands, and then for some reason you decide to delete that, yep. By deleting that entry within the defines, it won't delete it off the server. Oh. You'll have to like either manually remove it, or there are ways of, if you read install, there's ways of removing it off. So you have to be careful if you're creating new stuff. And if you're modifying existing stuff, a lot of the times it'll just replace and fix some of those changes. But if you're adding anything new and trying to remove something, sometimes it doesn't always register the same way. Because it's just reading in, it doesn't pull in and remove all the time. But there are a lot of cases where it does. So just be wary of that, essentially. Okay. A lot of text files, for example, like these WP configs, if you make a modification or change something within it, it'll modify it very easily. But there are cases where you have to be careful. Okay. So you can also run Salt. You can also run on HP. You can also run this command, state apply. And so you can always go into Salt. If you want to apply a specific file to a specific node, you can always do that. So within WordPress, for example, if you want to run this deploy piece that runs every 5 minutes in advance instead of waiting 5 minutes,
yeah,
you would choose the relative link within Salt. So WordPress/deploy HB, and you usually don't include the SLS file. So this will deploy basically what is in the repo for HB blog, and just when you run it, it'll actually just run those changes.
Okay. Got it.
And so it runs just that individual file.
Makes a lot of sense. I like that one.
And so you can do that with anything. That's just one example. And then you'll also, so how we handle WordPress updates and also how we handle WordPress core and plugin updates. I haven't put those commands here, but someone will need to actually go in and run those commands.
Yeah, and how often do we run those?
Once a month is fine, usually, just to stay up to date. Usually you can do it all. Usually I do it all within a night, maybe 2 hours, not even, depending on how quick you can go through it. It does take sometimes a while to run, but sometimes you have to also be careful, because I've run into issues where I've updated the core and it broke the entire site.
Oh man.
So you have to also make sure you monitor that stuff too. And the good thing about WordPress CLI, you can also revert back to different core versions.
Oh, very cool.
And so if you run into issues that way, you can always do that.
So show me those commands, because I imagine we're going to be executing those once a month as well.
Yes, I will add them to this list. They're not here at the moment.
Okay.
I can, and then yeah, those will, and I'll explain kind of some of the issues that you might run into. Oh, so here's basically what it is. This is part of the command. Usually you can, this basically says right here, salts associated to the host, or basically the node, run on, so in this bin file is the WordPress CLI. So using WordPress CLI based on this path, which is variable HTML website. So we also created this relative link essentially so that this can be applied for any site. So instead of using, before it was /var/html/www.website.com.
Yeah.
And so you can always easily, no matter what site you're on, you can easily know that website will also apply to any unique website instead of having to define that every single time, and then running whatever that WordPress command is. And so I think we created a special WordPress core one, and then I think the plugin one uses the standard update plugin one. And so you'll also see some of those. You'll also make sure that when you're running those, sometimes there are some changes that happen to those plugins over time, where some of the group and the user permissions get changed. And so if that happens, you might see that some of those plugins will not get updated. And so when you log in, or when you go into the servers, you might need to modify some of those, the user and group back to www root.
Okay.
I will document that too. This is just to speak.
No. That's good to know. It's good to know. Okay.
I think that's it from a very high level description of SaltStack and the way we use it. But essentially, yeah,